This is Luke Allison with CriticalBench.com, and I'm here with Eric Cressey. Eric, how are you?
Not too bad. How's it going, Luke?
Going good. I wanted to sort of get into your background. You have a reputation for working with baseball pitchers and being a bit of an expert. And I'm wondering, was this a specific goal, and sort of how did that come to be?
You know, it's actually interesting. My background, before that had been more actually dealing with basketball and soccer athletes when I was in grad school and kind of helping out with some of the teams at the University of Connecticut under Chris West. But after I finished my master's and I went to the private sector, it just so happened that some of the first athletes that I started working with were baseball guys. And with my own personal background of having a lot of shoulder issues, and I was a tennis player growing up, so I had a lot of kind of background with respect to overhead athletes, at least experience-wise. It was kind of a natural fit for me, and things just took off, and those guys got some good results, and really word of mouth blew it up, and here we are a few years later. But the funny thing about it is my mom always jokes that I was destined for training baseball players because I taught myself to read with baseball cards when I was little because I recognized all the pro players, and all I had to do was match their faces up with the names on the card, and I kind of learned that way. So I guess part of it was subconscious and part of it was very conscious.
It's an interesting, story because it never has, the twists and turns that you would expect. I don't know if we're at a point where someone can grow up and go, I want to work with baseball pitchers. I want to work with baseball pitchers, but
no, it doesn't work that way at all. Especially in this industry where strength and conditioning as a field and a whole it's a very dynamic industry. It's constantly changing and constantly evolving. So, if you're going to do that, you really got to know from day one what your true passion is, because that's what you kind of have to adhere to, and that's what you have to read on and stay on top of. So, no, I think a lot more people have to go through internships and go through experiences to realize what it is and what they what they don't want to do. I did internships in cardiac and pulmonary rehab when I was growing up, and it wasn't a good fit for me, but I needed to have that experience in order to know. So it's
right.
A little tougher nowadays than when we always say we wanted to be astronauts or professional baseball players.
Sure. I wanted to get in a little bit of your experience sort of working with athletes from different sports. One of the things that I notice a lot is the amount of feedback from various sports is extremely different. Something like pitching, you have really sort of high quantitative, just off the charts in terms of feedback, whereas something like, some of the positions in football or powerlifting, there's basically no feedback for a lot of the time.
Yeah, it's entirely different. The thing about baseball that's I've had professional players who have 20-inch vertical jumps who can throw 95 miles an hour. And it's the same reason why, a lot of guys look at me and I may not be the most jack guy in the gym or on the surface look like really that physically daunting, but I got a good deadlift. It comes down to being very, very, neurally efficient with very specific motions. So just like you or I could get good at a deadlift or a bench press, some people get very, very efficient with their mechanics on the mound. They may have very good hand-eye coordination and very efficient in rotational power at the plate. So that's where they're unique, and that a lot of times baseball players are very successful because of traits and not necessarily, things that are really trainable. So a lot of times our training is more focused on how to allow them to make better use of those traits, how to manage them so that they don't get hurt. If you look at the research on major league pitchers, actually major league players on the whole, about 89% of them have a positive sulcus sign in both their throwing and non-throwing shoulder. So what that tells you is those people have a very high amount of congenital laxity. They have a lot of freaky joint range of motion that allows them to throw baseball hard. If you look at hand-eye coordination, you're not going to play professional baseball as a hitter unless you have, at least 20/15 or more like 20/10 vision. So, those are things that influence, success in this sport that may not be governed by purely athleticism. So a lot more of what we sometimes have to do, unfortunately, is, we're not necessarily dealing with freak athletes. What we're dealing with is very good tradesmen who need to learn how to stay successful in spite of the fact that they may be playing, over 200 games a year between spring training and the regular season and postseason and all that.
I think you bring up some really sort of interesting things with vision and sort of joint, laxity and whatnot. Can you tell the difference between something an athlete is interested in, whether that's a lift or a sport, versus something they have an actual aptitude for?
Yeah, I mean, that's the million-dollar question. I think that's what, professional baseball scouting all comes down to is, how can you figure out who the best players are at the youngest ages and get them to the big leagues as quickly as possible. That's how you win games. If you go back and look at the Boston Red Sox in 2007 when they won the World Series, I mean, they had, probably 5 or 6 of the top 30 players in baseball under contract all combined for under $6 million. So they got their talent to the big leagues quickly. So that's partly development, but it's also very good amateur scouting and getting people in the right systems. So, no, I don't know that it's as easy as we might think because, anyone who's trained young athletes has come to appreciate that everything changes around ages 14 and 15. When a kid goes through puberty, he may be going from being completely unstable to being so stable that he's in fact immobile. So bodies change a lot when your femur grows 2 inches in the course of a year, and all these things dramatically change, and you're kind of dealing with a new body. So, really for us, kind of the telltale sign is most of our kids. Sophomore/junior year of high school is when you can really start to tell, who's going to really take to this, who's going to be a stud in their sport, and they kind of separate each other out. It's very, very interesting in the sense that, our 2011 class, which are seniors, we have 21 kids in the class of 2011 who have committed to Division I baseball scholarships here at our facility in Massachusetts. By that same token, right now we only have one in the class of 2012 who's given a verbal commitment. So it's just it's very early, and what's going to happen is over the next month, literally, we're going to find out which kids are going to come out of the woodwork and be really, really special, and which kids are going to need more time to develop and maybe not hit that level. So it's kind of an eye-opening experience when you see how quickly things change at that age and how big their windows of adaptation are.
Yeah, it's always been a bit of a mystery. I worked very briefly with players, and I was not entirely sure, as they box squat and they're sort of rotating, to their pitching side, and I'm like, what is this? And it's like, oh, he's a left-handed pitcher, and you're like, oh, okay.
It's pretty profound. One of the schools of thought we've started looking a lot more at. I got turned on to it by my buddy Neil, who works for the Diamondbacks. There's a school of thought called the Postural Restoration Institute, and it was actually founded by a dentist from Nebraska named Ron Haruska. And really what he looked at is, our anatomy, going all the way back to just, seeing what cadavers look like. And when you think about it, we're always taught, you have 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 arms, 2 legs, we're built symmetrically, right? Well, what no one really talks about is, we have a liver on the right side, we have a heart, we have a vena cava on the left side, we have more prominent diaphragmatic attachments to the spine and a more prominent leaflet on the right side as well. There's 2 lobes to one lung versus 3 in the other lung. So really we're not as symmetrical as you might think, and all these internal organs differences, can actually be, very, very apparent in the way that we carry ourselves. And I have an article coming out at T-Nation here pretty soon that touches on it a lot. But what we ultimately find out happens is a lot of these right-handed individuals who spend their entire life playing a right-handed dominant sport re-ingrain the natural asymmetry that we see on such a level that, it becomes pathological. So if you go into like any professional baseball clubhouse or even like Little League or high school or anything, look around at the number of right-handed players who have low right shoulders. I mean, you'll see kids that have, a right shoulder that's a good like 2 inches below the left, and then you go around and you look at all the left-handed kids and nobody has a low left shoulder. It's really a structural adaptation that starts with respiratory function and affects the orientation of the spine, the hips, the scapula, the rib cage, all of it. It's pretty powerful stuff. And we've done some a lot of before-after pictures of the guys, and you can literally see how those asymmetries go down during the off season as they train to address them and they step away from their sport for a while. And you compare them to the pictures after the next season, and you see a lot of this stuff comes back just because of their throwing volume. So it's always kind of just managing guys and keeping them away from threshold as best as you can.
It seems like throwing is something that's right on the verge of whether or not it's a good idea or not.
Oh, it's a terrible idea.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll go with that then.
Yeah. It's the single fastest motion in all of sports. You're looking at over 7,000 degrees per second of internal rotation at the humerus. So if you take your humeral head, so the ball and socket that is your shoulder, that's 20 revolutions in a matter of a second. That's how fast things are going. So, you take a shoulder that is moving at that high a speed, and, you keep in mind that a lot of times that's a very lax shoulder as it is. You need so much dynamic stabilization from not only your rotator cuff, but also, your scapular stabilizers, your lat, your core, your lower half. everything really has to sync up perfectly in order to just keep your arm from flying off your body. That it really is kind of an impressive, like, physiological,
that it's possible
craziness.
that it doesn't just sort of separate from the body or something.
Exactly. I mean, and you don't have to look any further than some of the stuff that happens. I mean, you look at the load on the UCL during every throw. I mean, you're at near failure load, so it really takes a combination of both, like, active restraints, so muscles and tendons, working hand in hand with, passive restraints like ligaments, your labrum, things like that may not adapt to stress. And they have to line up perfectly.
There's an idea about, obviously you just said pitching is, not necessarily a tremendous idea, but there's also an idea right now in football that sort of slamming into each other thousands and thousands of times, causes trauma to the brain, which essentially kills the brain. Are these sort of changes that you would see affecting who participates in what sport, over the next 5 to 10 years?
I don't know that. Put it this way, I don't think we're ever going to take away from athletic participation, just by scaring people. I think, you're going to see more precautions in terms of, protective equipment and things like that. But more than anything, what I'd like to see is people learning how to manage athletes better. We may not be able to control, concussions and things like that as much as we'd like, but at the same time, what we can control are the ACLs. We can control the Tommy Johns. We can control things like that are very preventable with training. But, I trained Kevin Youkilis from the Boston Red Sox, and he actually gave a really good interview the other day where they asked him, like, how are you feeling after, you had thumb surgery last year? And he's like, I feel great right now, and that's all going to change tomorrow, because the second you get in season, literally what happens is, you're never 100% until it's over again. So in a situation like that, it's going to, you just have to appreciate that, anything at the highest level of sports is not going to be inherently healthy. That's why these guys get, paid a lot of money to play, is that they really are, beating up on their body, and it's why you see guys who were retired wind up with arthritis. And I think Terry Francona, who's the Red Sox coach right now, has had 32 knee surgeries in his life. So it goes to show you that these guys are really putting their body on the line all the time. So it's one thing for you or I to go in the gym and lift 4 days a week, but you got to remember these guys might lift 4 days a week on top of hitting, throwing, sprinting, doing medicine ball stuff, taking ground balls, all that stuff, and it really does add up. And over time it can beat you up.
Talk a little bit about the range of injuries you're going to see from throwing.
The range of injuries?
Yeah.
It really what everything comes down to in the context of throwing, if you want to sum up the overwhelming majority of injuries, it's really going to take place at the point where the arm goes from extreme external rotation, so like the end of the cocking phase, right where you transition to acceleration. So, we call that the peel back mechanism at the shoulder. And what happens when you're all the way laid back, your forearm's parallel to the ground and you're getting ready to whip forward, essentially what you have going on is your biceps tendon is twisting and it's pulling off of the superior labrum. So in that, you can get irritation of the biceps tendon as it kind of slips in and out of the bicipital groove. You can get irritation, obviously, the superior labrum because it can tug off. That's why a lot of guys have fraying and, ultimately some guys wind up with tears. But in that same position, you can get what we call an internal impingement of the rotator cuff. So in a weight training population, we see more of a bursal-sided issue. So the top side of the rotator cuff gets irritated under the acromion process. In throwers, and swimmers, tennis players, all of them, we see more of an internal impingement. So it's actually a posterior impingement that happens way back in external rotation, and what happens is the undersurface of the rotator cuff gets irritated. So those are traditionally much tougher tears. They don't tend to heal very well because of the location and the poor blood supply. So at the shoulder, your big three are going to be biceps tendon, rotator cuff, and labrum. And, a lot of guys have a little bit of each. 79% of major league pitchers have abnormal labral features. There are really high numbers on partial thickness cuff tear as well. So you can have quite a bit of structural abnormalities on an MRI or on an X-ray, and that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be pathological. But that same instant, can cause a lot of trouble with the elbow as well. So when you're laid back right there, it's a lot of what we call valgus stress on the elbow, and that can really wreak havoc with both the ulnar nerve, the ulnar collateral ligament. You can get flexor, pronator strains. So really medial elbow pain is your most common one. In the younger population, you can get some lateral pain, which is more of like a bony compressive type injury. But I mean, really, a lot of injuries do change over the course of the lifespan. In younger kids, where the bone is the path of least resistance, you're going to see more growth plate injuries. As guys get older, you're going to see more ligament and soft tissue issues because those are the path of least resistance after the bones mature. So lots of stuff to consider.
Yeah, lots of different ways to sort of go about, being unhealthy and whatnot. One thing I noticed, and I'm not sure if there's a pattern, this would be certainly more of your area, but noticing things that would be, throwing injuries, labrum injuries, broken humerus, detached biceps in athletes that do not throw.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, you will certainly see it. A lot of times you'll see it in like the guys who haven't done it for a long time, and then they go out and they decide they want to play beer league softball. But
sure,
you will see some pretty crazy stuff. I mean, and you got to remember, like if we're talking about like a labral tear, there's certainly different kinds of labral tears. You'll see more anterior labral tears in a weightlifting population, whereas everything you see in throwers tends to be posterior, and if it is anterior, it's after a long time and it's migrated forward. But I mean, it's the other thing you have to consider is, think about what's happened in Major League Baseball. I mean, they waste literally billions of dollars on players who are injured on the disabled list every year. And the question becomes, why is that happening? Is it happening because they have terrible strength conditioning programs? Is it because players are lazy and out of shape? Is it because the nature of the sport is so demanding? No one ever points the finger at what I think the most obvious, kind of rationale for it is, and that's because kids have been overused for years. They've been beaten up in the younger ranks and, thrown with poor mechanics and been, insufficiently strong and flexible. And what's happened is, they've just taken years and years and years to reach threshold. So we may see a 23-year-old kid who gets, a Tommy John. In reality, he probably had a partial UCL tear when he was 14, and he just managed it and went in and out in physical therapy for years and just kept doing the same old stupid stuff over and over again. So a lot of times these issues just come, they take time to reach threshold, but, is it socially acceptable to do an elbow surgery on a 14-year-old? Probably not. At 23, is it okay? Yeah, absolutely. Kid's mature, he can speak for himself. Go ahead and do it. So I think, the problem is a lot bigger than just what's going on in professional baseball. It has a lot to do with the AAU generation and how kids are managing themselves.
Is that something that you can manage specifically through, I guess, the finite facets of baseball? Can you put people on pitch counts? Can you have the state athletic association saying can only throw so many pitches, or can you change the way
they've worked
Major League?
They've worked too. USA Baseball has put out their pitch count recommendations, and the ASMI has put some good stuff out and all that. But my answer would be, can you keep kids healthy? Yeah, absolutely. I know that I've been working heavily with baseball players since 2006, and knock on wood, we have never had a Tommy John on our watch. That's an incredibly powerful thing when I can tell you we have 85% of our clients as baseball players. I've rehabbed a ton of guys who have come after them, but we've never had anybody that's trained with us for an extended period of time have a Tommy John. And if you look at what goes on in terms of geography, people in warm weather climates tend to have lower injury counts than people in cold weather climates have lower injury counts than people in warm weather climates. So just being in a different environment, training differently, having different appreciation for how to manage yourself within the competitive year, you begin to appreciate that, you really can prevent these injuries.
And that becomes ingrained, obviously. Then you have places to go, and you learn that, and
I think so.
Become perpetuating. Okay.
And I think the biggest part of it is you make young athletes informed consumers. They know how to take care of themselves. They're not always going to be on my watch. Eventually some of our high school kids are going to get drafted, and they're going to be playing in rookie ball out in Montana by themselves. And, I want to make sure that we've educated those kids so that when the day does come that they have to stand on their own 2 feet, they're going to be in a position where it's going to be like a piece of cake. So it's tough.
One of the other things that you're sort of known for is, I guess, a treatise that you did on unstable surface training.
Yeah.
Is that something that you can sort of summarize really quick for maybe someone that didn't come across the journal article?
Yeah. At the University of Connecticut, for my grad degree from 2003 to 2005, my master's thesis was basically the first ever long-term training intervention. So we had over 30 subjects for a matter of 10 weeks And basically what we did is we effectively replaced about 2 to 3% of their training volume on stable surfaces with unstable surface training. So they were soccer players, and we pre and post tested them on some plyometric measures, so a counter movement jump and a balance drop jump. Test them on an agility measure, so a T test, and both a 10 and a 40-yard sprint. And what we basically were looking at is, what happens to strength and power when you replace even a small percentage of training volume, with this unstable surface training. And really what we were trying to do is we were trying to simulate what happens in most programs when people do include, lunges onto the BOSU ball or single leg squats on the Dynadisc or whatever it may be. So we went through all that, and the results were published in Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research back in August of 2007, and, I delivered my thesis, probably about the April before that. And really what was interesting is we found that, while these things may be very, very useful in ankle rehabilitation and all that, you got to be really, really careful about applying them in a healthy population because you can look all the way back to the research. In 1966, they showed in the research that, proprioception is very, very, very skill specific, meaning, just because you can stand well on a unstable surface, which is, a lot of static, balancing, proficiency, does not necessarily mean that it's going to carry over to dynamic activities. So, for us, our conclusions were we recommended that, people use them in extreme moderation, if at all, in healthy athletes with no history of ankle sprain. And that's, markedly different than what you're going to see in the real world nowadays. And I went on and I wrote like a 95-page ebook up on it and talked about different, functional balance training strategies and all that. But it was pretty eye-opening that even that small amount of unstable surface training could have such a profound long-term training consequence.
It just seemed necessary to point out because, you still see people, on a stability ball or on a BOSU ball or on a disc, just constantly.
We found out that the athletes that we tested, we did it during their spring soccer season, and we accounted for training experience, previous history, injury, all that stuff. And what we found was that all these guys were 97% the same with their programming, but what the big difference was disinclusion. We found that everybody improved on these measures. They got faster, they jumped higher, things like that. But the stable surface exclusively training group improved more. So what it did was it attenuated improvements in the unstable surface group. And they can go online. It's on PubMed if they want to read it. It's if you go to unstablesurfacetraining.com, there's stuff up there as well. So there's definitely places to check it out.
There was sort of a corollary to that I wanted to ask you about because I know you have a powerlifting background also. Certain people, certain styles of thought, certain training methods, you'll see people squat on the foam or you'll see them board press off of foam.
Yeah.
Is that in any way the same, or is that completely different?
That's going to be totally different. When you're squatting to foam, it's a lot different. We're talking about, our study was exclusively looking at lower body unstable surface training. So when the unstable implement was between the floor and the ground. So what you're talking about in those situations, you still are inherently stable at your points of contact with the ground. Likewise, if you look at the research, there also appears to be a difference in the way that we react between upper body and lower body unstable surface training. So a push-up on a BOSU ball may actually be a great exercise. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Most of the time our lower body works in closed chain motion, so our feet are on stable ground, whereas our upper body kind of works on a little bit of both. We got open and closed chain responsibilities in our daily lives. So I think that accounts for some of the difference, but we still use some unstable surface stuff in our upper body. We tend to stay away from it in the lower body, though.
It's as complicated as you want to make it. I think that's one of the things that, you have to make it accessible for everybody.
Absolutely.
There's sort of an idea sort of out there, sort of floating around in the market that maybe not, you can sort of write your own programming and be your own expert. Is that something you think is possible, based on sort of limitations and bias?
I think it's possible, but it definitely takes time. I know for me personally, like we have interns at our facility all the time, and I'm always blown away at how awful the programs they write are the first time that I actually take a look at them and we go over and we start talking about how to do it. I usually give them a pretty serious programming challenge, and I set a deadline on time on how long they have to do it, and then we look over it and we talk about how they could be better with respect to the unique situations that I outlined. But no, I think, put it this way. there are people who have jumped in and become successful personal trainers over the course of time because they're self-educated and they never took a class on how to do this, but it definitely takes time. But at same token, I don't do my own taxes. If I need a contract, I would never write my own. I would go to a lawyer to have him do it. So I think the question is not just can it be done. I think the question is can it be done efficiently and done well? Because everybody can go and grab TurboTax and try to do their own taxes, and what do? They miss out on a bunch of important write-offs. Maybe they miss out on something that's going to get them audited. So it's one of those things where I think you have to figure out whether it's really in your realm of expertise or whether your time is better spent elsewhere, especially if it means you're going to have markedly poorer results doing it on your own. So that's where it gets tricky. But I try to self-educate people as much as I can, and that's some of the stuff I've done on my blog is just gradually teaching people how to understand that there are certain core principles that every program needs, and you're just going to tinker with those to make things right.
We live in sort of a strange, I guess, point in time where outside expertise is available through yourself, someone like Mike Robertson at iFast. But it's totally unclear. It's like I'm in high school. I have a strength and conditioning coach. I'm in college. I have a position coach and a strength coach. And there's a graduate kinesiology program here. Mm-hmm. Sort of, where do you see the need for sort of outside help?
That's the $1,000,000 question. I think obviously anybody who's too busy to even give it the thought of their own. We have a lot of clients who want to just show up, do their thing, and get out of here. And I appreciate that like you wouldn't believe. It's no different than me wanting to just pay somebody to do my taxes. So I think that's an obvious one. I think the other situation is people who are coming off of injuries. That's an absolute no-no in terms of doing your own thing because one, an injury situation, you have unique physiological needs. There are neurological changes, there are structural changes. You're fundamentally not the same as everyone else. So going to just trying to pull something together on your own is not necessarily going to be a good idea. If you're a generally healthy guy, you have a fair amount of training experience, you haven't accumulated a bunch of issues, yeah, you can get away with experimenting, pulling some stuff together for yourself. But, I find that those people are the ones that after the course of time, they realize that, they're better off kind of referring out and, deferring to people's expertise just because it gives them the variety they need and they get to experience, different training styles and see what it is that works best for you. I think a lot of times when we write our own programs, we're more inclined to do what we're good at, not necessarily what we need.
Right. I think we all sort of fall into that from time to time. To go back to program design, just for a little bit, is there anything that you have sort of really strong feelings about in terms of program design?
Oh, yikes. I could go on all day about it. I think the biggest thing is, that people, I think most of the people I see are maybe your typical internet consumers. A lot of people really are convinced that they're more advanced than they really are. And I think people get, too far away from the basics sometimes because they're convinced that they're physiologically different than someone else. A lot of times, I'll take a poorly written program executed at 100% effort over something that's incredibly well thought out and then just executed at subpar. So I think a lot of people need to spend less time thinking about how special they are and more time just busting their ass and working harder. It's maybe it's a little bit short to say and all that, but really that's the impression I get of a lot of people. I'd say the one other thing that I see a lot of is people don't appreciate that sometimes the easiest way to get bigger is to build a good pool of strength beforehand. I know for me personally, I spent so much time, so many years trying to stay as a legit 165 in powerlifting that literally in the 3 months after I decided I was done at 165, I ballooned up to 192, and I've just kind of hovered there ever since. It was like my body knew exactly where it needed to be in light of the strength levels I had, and literally I've hovered kind of at that weight class, for another couple of years because my body kind of had this place where it wanted to go. So I think for a lot of people, they spend so much time trying to find these elaborate rep protocols and trying to creep weight up. Sometimes just get stronger. I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, and I guess that brings in sort of different aspects of self-discipline and where did you learn to work hard and things like that don't have anything to do with program design. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess just to close up, I've taken up quite a bit of your time, but if people are in sort of the Boston area or they're in New England, how do they find you? How do they get in touch with you?
Well, our website for the facility is CresseyPerformance.com. It's just CRESSEY performance.com, and my personal website is just EricCressey.com, EricCressey, and we've got a free daily blog and biweekly newsletter and all that stuff. So it's a good time, but there's lots of ways to get in touch with me. I'm pretty accessible.
Well, Eric, I appreciate the time. It certainly, a little for action, a little scary, a little bit, but certainly informative. I definitely appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care.
You too.